Number 4. My grandfather owned a large herd of sheep, which during the summer grazed in the mountains in central Utah. In the 1960s, his sheep herder was a small Mexican man named Juan. Juan stayed in a very small trailer in a meadow while tending the sheep. One evening, Grandpa drives his truck up the mountain to deliver some food and supplies to Juan. As he nears Juan's camp, he starts seeing dead sheep all over the ground. Many of the sheep are thrashed into pieces. As he arrives at Juan's trailer, he finds the door shut. He has to kick the door open to get inside, as Juan has locked it. Inside, Juan is curled up into a ball, mumbling incoherently and likely in shock. My grandfather picks up Juan, throws him into the truck, and takes off down the mountain to get Juan to a doctor. As he's flying down the twisty dirt road, Grandpa gets this terrible feeling like he's being watched and sees something out the corner of his eye. By this time, the sun is setting and the light isn't very good. He turns to look out the passenger side window and sees a creature he describes as looking like an inside-out deer running alongside the truck. The creature dropped back out of sight, only to come bounding back even faster, running on its hind legs only. The creature then ran across the road right in front of the truck. My grandfather swerves to miss it and ends up rolling the truck down the mountainside. Juan is killed in the accident, and my grandfather spends more than a month in the hospital. Now, it's possible that Grandpa was just playing with us, but that really wasn't his style. He was an old cowboy and swore that this was the truth. He brought it up when we were making fun of chupacabras. He believed that it was some sort of chupacabra-like animal that he saw.
Number 3.
So this happened about 12 years ago. My family owns a farm in the heart of an Indian reservation. One winter, I was home for Christmas taking care of the farm while my parents were away Christmas shopping. I was home by myself, and it was pretty late, and I hear our cows start freaking out. I knew it had to be the wild dogs that are rampant in the area, so I throw on some boots, grab a shotgun, load it up, and head out to the field. This is the perfect scenario for a horror movie, as it was cloudy but there was a full moon, and it was breaking through the clouds just right to light up all the snow. I ran out into the middle of the field, just in time to see 2 dogs. They were standing up facing each other and fighting. I think to myself, perfect, 2 for 1. So I pump a shell into the chamber of the 12 gauge, and that's when it happened. The 2 dogs heard the rat. They both stopped, looked over at me, and ran away, but on their back legs. Immediately I froze, and every ghost story about skinwalkers and all the other native legends I grew up with flew through my mind. Keep in mind that I'm a white guy, and up until then, these were all just boogeyman stories the native kids like to tell to scare us. Well, that night, they became real to me.
Number 2.
My grandmother on my mother's side has always been very superstitious, for lack of a better word. She's not religious, but she does believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she'd never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visit was pretty eventful, typical boring old people stuff, except she always kept the curtains drawn shut and would always peek out the window, and when someone asked what she was doing, she would simply reply, "Yenodushi is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit, until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandma, and then baby brother, he's 19 now, were in the front yard that evening planting flowers when all of a sudden, my grandmother starts shouting, "Get away from that creature, it's not safe." Of course, being Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, so we all run outside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large, black Great Dane-sized dog. It was staring at my grandmother with an intensity I'd never seen before. It looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she kept repeating, "The Yenodushi has found me." She moved a couple weeks after that.
Number 1.
Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now we knew all the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Utah people considered sacred. I'll admit I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in church, you don't let the American flag touch the ground, and you don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway, and since no one else was going, he managed to drag me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before. Though only once, his manipulative ploy had been to get me to go with him, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to each other. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Utah didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This apparently was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to pee. I stepped off the main road just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing just past a shallow creek with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me. As I looked at the log, it didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other side, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. Though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush, but suddenly it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rock, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them. Symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around as if they had actually been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that was just unsettling. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only half over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There was no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head, moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees and often I would see that buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it, but he finally went silent, and we still both heard the rustling. Now, even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it at the time. It was funny. "Hey, Buck, you horny motherfucker! Leave us alone!" He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark!" I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark!" I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far. I knew because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there was signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. "Mark!" I called out furiously now, forgetting the trail for a second. I ran forward along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it hurt you. And a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again. "Mark!" Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped out through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself it wasn't real. At first I saw a head, the head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared-looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all the horns of this average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized, a mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and legs. They started human, but near the bottom they started distorting and became animal-like. At the ends of its legs were powerful hoofs. At the end of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as its horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body, apathetically, and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang suddenly. It's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logic side of my mind shut off, I turned around. and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me I heard a powerful grunt and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all of my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on the back of my neck. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going in the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up the trail, at the point where it went up between two mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing near the beginning of the trail, was the skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in my dreams, nightmares, that creature, the skinwalker. Somehow I doubt the forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite, because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long, had been quietly penetrated.